Christendom with David Rietveld. Major cultural change has made a big impact on Christians and the church. Something radical has happened. Admitting that you believe and follow Jesus feels weird or weirds people out like it never has before. Doing church like we always have no longer leads to the same results. We're thinking that our church is running well. We have quality programs, gifted musicians, clear biblical practical teaching, no messy tensions, and it used to be that when church was like that, we grew. There was a sense of vitality, of momentum. And yet David Rietveld, old friend, now senior minister at Dapto Anglican Church south of Sydney, says, well, actually, there's few new people and less regulars attending. How do we make sense of it all? And how do we respond? David's new book, Being Christian After Christendom, is an analysis of how the West has shifted from a Christian worldview to a post-Christian worldview. It's super helpful. It's significantly simpler than Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Christopher Watkins' Biblical Critical Theory. And whereas Brian Rosner's book is more about the individual story, this one is aimed at us as church leaders and helping us how to navigate the new territory. David, thanks for coming in, and more than ever it feels like we're standing on unstable ground and our hearts go out to pastors everywhere.
Yes, Dominic. Things are kind of happening in the world. Just this week in Queensland, you can change your gender on your birth certificate, whether or not you've had any gender reassignment surgery or anything. It's just a matter of choice now. And helping our parishioners make sense of the world that they live in, helping them understand where God fits in and why they're kind of feeling so questioned, doubted. People are sceptical of them. People are kind of critical. They think religious people are bullies and judgmental. How do you raise your children? How do you have dialogues with them? How do you kind of do church when the ground has shifted? I think it's got everybody feeling a little bit anxious and unsure. And I want to try and name up what has changed and talk about how it is that we can kind of posture as Christians in the new context we find ourselves.
So what has changed? Where are we?
Yeah, so I think for about 1600 years, from the year roughly 400 to 2000, there was something that we called Christendom, where Christians and non-practicing Christians, pretty much everyone believed in God. Everyone sensed there was a moral fabric to the universe. Everyone believed that Jesus was a good guy. He was the example we're meant to follow, that the Bible was a compilation of wise sayings. God saw everything we did, and there would be one day a day of account, and our eternal destiny would be determined by what happened on that day. Everyone believed that, and in that context, I think discipleship and evangelism kind of fitted like a hand into a glove.
So are we just the unlucky ones who happen to be pastors this generation, and it would have been so much simpler 4 generations ago?
Wow, I went for a walk with one of the retired clergy in my first church, and I said to him, describe for ministry in 1950, 1960, when you first came into ministry. And he just said, look, I preached, I ran baptisms, funerals, visited the new people who connected with our church. And if you're a nice guy, the church just grew. And that was my job. And I kind of thought, that is nothing like my job.
No.
And it's nothing like the world in which we minister now.
Talking to my wife's boss, he's a small businessman. He runs a doctor's practice. And I thought, actually, there's so many aspects of my job leading the church that are the same as his job leading a practice. I mean, yes, there's care for people and all that kind of thing, but actually just thinking about all the issues of management.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of compliance issues. There's kind of management issues. People are less available to do volunteer work. But there's a fundamental culture shift, right? And I think, for instance, people are treating churches a little bit more like consumers. So we had those values in Christendom. It was kind of like God was at the centre of the universe, but now people have themselves at the centre of their universe. and they imagine that somehow I'm here to flourish, I'm the expert on me, I know what kind of fills my tank, and somehow religion and God are backed into that worldview, and we end up with a slightly different faith or gospel than the one that people heard 50, 60 years ago.
I'm just going to jump in on page 56 of your book, and you just defined for us the worldview of Christendom.
Yeah.
Here's how you define the worldview of the post-Christian worldview. I am unique and exceptional with distinct passions and gifts. I am the expert on me. I understand myself better than others do. My passions, giftings and sexuality combine to form my sense of self, my identity. When I express my true inner self through my choices, I am being authentic. I'm being true to who I am. I will feel positive about myself and my self-esteem will be healthy. This will empower me to become my best self. I will flourish and thrive. Other people may undermine my sense of self. Driven by self-interest, individuals and institutions may seek to influence me and deny me freedom. You go on, but just unpack some of that for us.
Yeah, so we've shifted from a world where God was at the beginning of history and drawing us to himself at the end of history, to a world where I don't know what's happened before me, I'm not quite sure what's happening after me, but I'm at the centre of my universe. And I'm the expert on me. I understand myself in ways that others don't. And others actually have a bias. They want to cramp my style. It's unjust for them to step in and to kind of tell me what to do. And I will become my best self as I tell my story. Those are the assumptions. And I had a friend who used my book, showed a quote like that to a bunch of Christian school students from a school where 70% of the families are from Christian families. 70% of the children come from Christian families. It's in a Bible Belt suburb. The teacher read out those statements and the students all said, yeah, that's right, we believe that. So this has been imbibed by the next generation of younger people growing up in churches even.
So the outcome, that generation or that person would critique the worldview of the Christian or the Christian worldview, saying the outcome of that, and I'm quoting you, is arrogance, power-hungry, moralistic, misogynist, leaking old rust bucket.
Yeah.
What's the outcome of the post-Christian worldview?
Yeah, that's... I'll bounce off your first statement. So I think you have 20% in the American stats of kids who've been discipled in Christian families who are now quite anti-Christian, and that would be their critique of Christianity. I think there's another... 1
in 4 kids.
Yeah.
So in a family of 4, you should expect 1 kid to be like this.
Well, hopefully not, but yeah, statistically. And maybe 2 in 4 are what Barna calls non-resilient Christian kids. Right? So they actually have a faith that's a little bit flaky. So they would disagree with that assessment. They would they have a modified view of Christianity where God is somehow there as, if I'm here to flourish, if I'm here to thrive, God's like a gardener who throws fertilizer everywhere. He's somehow here to stop suffering and make me thrive and flourish. So it's a me-centered universe with God in it. So I think that's what the child who's grown up in the post-Christendom West, but inside a church, probably is hearing, I'm not saying we're saying this, but they're hearing a modified version of the gospel. And they become non-resilient Christians. What are the consequences of the post-Christian worldview? I think we're seeing rising rates of anxiety, depression. I think some people are doing fine on the surface, and the social media is a place where you've got to kind of put your best self out there, and we imagine that's how everybody else is doing. But yeah, underneath, I think there's a lot of anxiety and insecurity, and that's an opportunity for us to speak into that.
I got to the section on your book where you addressed it, and I was remembering a friend of mine on Facebook. He wrote, daughter got her first mobile phone for her 16th birthday. And I thought, oh, there's a Christian parent from a reasonably conservative. I mean, if he's giving the first phone only for 16th birthday,
yeah, that's late. That's late.
Already, she is twin screening it like a pro. I'm expecting productivity to decrease and anxiety and depression to skyrocket, but at least she'll no longer be the odd one out in her class and can join the coveted social milieu of girls who lie in bed at 2 a.m, scrolling Instagram, DMing each other and bathing in self-loathing.
Yeah, depression goes up in 2007, which is when more than 50% of kids have smartphones. There's a very close correlation there. It's no accident. Yeah, they facilitate a fear of missing out and a worldview that says that if I get what's going to make me happy, that will fulfill me. And it turns out it doesn't.
Post-Christian worldview, you say the cross used to be the symbol of love, but now the rainbow is the symbol of love.
Yeah, so religions have not only beliefs, but they have values, and they have symbols, and they have vocabulary, and they have rituals, and you combine those together and you get a worldview. And so what we're seeing is a transition away not just from Christian beliefs, but from Christian symbolism as well. So the cross used to mean love, but a particular type of love, a love that was sacrificial, where you put others first, and as you humble yourself, God honours and exalts you. Now we have a new symbol for love, and it's the rainbow, but it's got a different definition of love. So now love is tolerance, love is acceptance, love is empowering you to make choices so that you can be the best version of you that you want to be. And so that's kind of the debate that really happened around kind of the same-sex marriage debate, you know. Two competing definitions of love, each having its own symbol. And symbols are very powerful things in culture.
I was reflecting as I was reading your book about, and I mean, you really made the argument that as you painted the worldview of the post-Christian worldview, I think it was almost implicit that same-sex marriage was going to be approved as a result of that worldview. I was wondering whether you've reflected on where the post-Christian worldview leads one to in the debate about the voice in Australia. You didn't go there in the book, but I was wondering about that as I was reading.
Yeah. Identity politics champions the cause of minorities, but not all minorities. So some Christians are a bit upset. We're now a minority. How come we don't get voice? But it's not just any minority that gets voice. It's the minorities that were previously discriminated against. They are the ones who were previously unempowered or disempowered, and it's now just to champion their cause. And First Nations people would be somewhere near the top of the list, who quite rightly were perceived to have been done wrong against, discriminated against in the past. So we better champion them in the present and in the future. And so that's why, say, they get a voice, whereas my parents are migrants. Australia is a country that's a mixture of First Nations people, English history and migrants. Why don't we get a voice?
You're the migrant.
The migrants, yeah. And the answer is, well, because particularly white migrants like my forebears, we weren't discriminated against. So yeah, I think the voice is likely to get up because it fits with the narrative of championing particularly the minorities who were previously the most discriminated against. And actually, there's a little bit of truth to that. I'm not sure that's entirely wrong. Whether or not constitutionally making that something that we kind of enshrine in our constitution, that's another debate, whether or not that's a good idea. But to be perceived as somebody who votes no against the voice, I think is going to make you look judgmental and holding on to kind of traditional power. So I think that's going to be a hard a hard case to argue against.
Okay. Now, you say the post-Christian worldview is good at poking holes in other worldviews, but it has some big leaks itself.
Yes. We have a generation of young people who've been taught to deconstruct. I tell a story about my daughter. We're in the centre of Melbourne. We need to drive through Melbourne. We're going to drive to Sydney. I've said she can get some hours up. She's learning to drive. And she says, "Dad, hand me the keys." I say, no, wait till we get on the freeway, then you can drive. She's only a very fresh learner. And she's quite upset by this, and she starts telling me that she's good enough to drive in the city. I say, no, I'm not so sure. And she ends up saying, the categories of parent and child are only social constructs. I know I'm a good enough driver and I can drive, give me the keys. That is a weird argument. Generation gaps have existed for time immemorial, but I'm not sure anybody's ever come up with an argument like that. So yes, this generation...
Where did the discussion go from there?
Well, I sat there thinking, that's funny. I'm not sure paying for your school fees was a construct. I'm not sure driving you to sport and So
I'm on your side.
It went where all these conversations went. I said no, and she saw it as a power play.
Right.
And we agreed to disagree. What are the holes in this post-Christian worldview? Look, I think we're not kind of experts on self. We don't think, as I look at my wife and my children and the people I know best, I see moments where they aren't experts on themselves. And it would be naive for me to assume that I'm any different than them. So I think that would be one. I think the sense of I'm an individual, and yet where's it leading us? To loneliness. We have an epidemic of loneliness. And so I think we're actually more relational than what we acknowledge in our post-Christian worldview. I think we're also people who don't make autonomous individual decisions. I heard a line the other day, we don't have universities anymore, we have monoversities, because everybody more or less thinks the same. So the notion that somehow I make decisions free from the influence of others is, I think, just naive, and it's kind of not what's happening. So I think at its foundational level, there are some flaws here, and that's partially why we're seeing outcomes like loneliness and increased depression.
You talk about critiques, though, of it from 4 different quadrants, from the honour-shame culture, from the power-fear culture, from Buddhism, and ethical debates, various ethical debates.
Yeah, one of the dilemmas that we have as Westerners is that, particularly at the moment, we're not great at learning from the past. We just kind of think we now know better. And we actually need other lenses to get a sense of what is the good life, and the kind of shift that we're making at the moment in the West. Is this a healthy shift or not? Because all we can see is Christendom was bad, so if that's bad, let's go this way, that must be good, right? But what I try and do in the book is actually give some other lenses, and one is an honour-shame, which is what we tend to get in Eastern cultures, which, for instance, would say actually happiness doesn't come from being an individual. Happiness comes from being connected with a family. And when you're part of a tribe, and that tribe cares for you, and you're connected to that tribe, that actually brings some security. And I think that's a helpful insight. So this shift from individualism to extreme individualism is a move in the wrong direction. So an honour-shame culture would say. A power-fear culture, which would mostly be African, kind of says, actually, you need to align yourself under the right leadership. So a great example is the opening scene of The Lion King. There's peace in the kingdom because Mufasa sits on the throne. And when his brother Scar is on the throne, the entire kingdom falls apart. So we need to kind of have the right kingdom and the right king and the right values in our lives for life to kind of work. That's what a power-fear culture says. And yes, I use a couple of others. I use a kind of an ethical framework to try and demonstrate the flaws and the assumptions in the shift we're currently making.
Then, and I found this fascinating, you talked about how the different tribes within Christianity have responded to the post-Christian worldview. And you identified the liberals, the mainstream, the successfuls, and at that point you're including Hillsong and Bethel and places like that, and then the evangelicals. But what I found particularly interesting and thought-provoking, and I wondered if you'd give it to us here, is you drew an analogy between football teams in Melbourne and tribes of Christianity. And I'd not heard that before, and it rang true for me.
Yeah. I'm not the first person to notice that the world is not the way it used to be, and have a sense that something's not quite right here. Different tribes of Christianity have a different visceral response to what has gone wrong and what's the solution. And I kind of worked through those. You just mentioned the four that I name up. There, of course, can be a fifth and a sixth, but you've got to stop your list somewhere. So let's draw that as a kind of an analogy to football, because I was, when I was writing that particular chapter, I was working at a Baptist church in Victoria, right? And in Melbourne, first question is, what's your name? And the second question is, what's your footy team? Footy is the public religion. And I talked about how there are some different sort of teams. Collingwood is the team that everybody kind of loves to hate. So either you're completely for Collingwood or you're completely against Collingwood. Hawthorn is kind of a club that's always doing pretty well and they're easy to follow. So if you kind of move to Victoria, it's a kind of a club where you sort of say, actually, what's a safe club to join? If I join that club, everybody will like me and nobody will hate me. If you join Collingwood, you'll actually get lovers and haters, right? You'll get hated on. Then there are other clubs which are kind of less popular. North Melbourne would be a classic example at the moment, but they've got some really rusted on supporters. And I kind of draw some analogies that I think evangelicals are really rusted on. We're used to getting marginalised and treated with disdain and not given a seat at the table. And so if that's happening in the current culture, it's kind of like, that's not news for us. We've actually learned to cope with that, and that doesn't undermine our faith. But the more liberal denominations, which were kind of easier and more publicly acceptable, I think their adherents are struggling. And they're kind of actually going, well, if footy's on the decline, which it isn't, but you know, if footy's on the way out and it's being replaced by some other sport, then I'll just change to what's popular and is socially acceptable now. So I think conservative, or what Rodney Stark calls otherworldly belief systems, are more robust than belief systems that are popular and more aligned with the previous generation of culture. They find themselves with some flaky, wishy-washy adherents.
Now, as I was reading this, and the books have a lead time in production, I couldn't help but wondering, I mean, we have watched some extraordinary things happen with Hillsong over the last 12, 18 months.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether, you said the liberal, you drew a parallel between the liberal adherent and the Hawthorn supporter.
Yep.
And I was wondering whether or not you want to put the Pentecostal in as a Hawthorn or supporter as well, where there hasn't been that same resilience. Or did you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So
feel free to disagree. I mean, I was just shooting that idea.
Yeah. So just to unpack what I mean by a successful church, let's kind of switch over to newspapers for a minute, right? So in the newspaper business is a terrible business to be in at the moment, right? Sales are declining. And yet there's a couple of newspapers that are kind of doing okay. For whatever reasons.
But they've picked up subscriptions around the world rather than just in their home city and those kind of things.
Yeah. And you could get the impression that if we followed the recipe of the Washington Post, then we'd be doing okay too. Mm-hmm. And successful churches can run around and sort of say, look, we do marketing well, we do music well, we have great production values, we value excellence. Mm-hmm. If you'd have followed our formula in the 1980s and 1990s when we were kind of changing and you were sticking with your old habits and traditions, if you'd have followed our formula, actually you'd be successful like us too. So what's gone wrong is the fact that you guys weren't creative and energetic and you didn't do social media well and whatever it is, right? So that's their critique of what's gone wrong and what other churches should have done. But I think what we've seen is that too much focus on style and not enough focus on substance
hasn't proved resilient through COVID.
Yeah, that's right. And if the church experience is like a shot in the arm, or it's like going to the movies where you're in this parallel universe for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and you're reminded of an experience and you're immersed into another culture, and you can't reproduce that online, then yes, I think that's why kind of the Hillsong-esque church as production that gives you a shot in the arm, that formula didn't do well during COVID.
Mm. And actually hasn't had the intellectual rigour to survive the worldview change. Yeah,
because it isn't reinforced, mm-hmm. you know, so you can't sit there and analyse and make sense of what's happening as robustly as what you can if you've come from different traditions, which were more thought-engaging and dialoguing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you do is you, on the one hand, I end up feeling like the problem is worse, and then I think also it may not be quite as bad as I thought it was. You told a very helpful story about the church in the East crumbling and not being able to withstand the rise of Islam.
Yeah.
And then a similar or parallel thing going on in the West at the moment. Do you want to just kind of elaborate that?
Yeah. So we have this intuition that something has gone wrong, and then the question is, well, what? Mm. And I think you can kind of jump, broadly speaking, one of two ways. Is it internal? Did we make the mistakes? Did we somehow lose confidence in the gospel, or were we not successful enough, or did we lose our public prophetic voice? And the different tribes have different answers, but their internal answers, it was about what we got wrong that meant church attendance has declined, church influence has waned, or was it primarily external? So we now live in a world that is not God-centred but me-centred, a world that says, I fill my tank before I can fill others, rather than you come not to be served and to serve. Mm-hmm. We live in a world where suffering is something I have a right not to experience because it lowers my self-esteem, whereas we used to live in a world where somehow God could bring about redemption through suffering, and suffering brought perseverance, character and hope. So we're living in a world where the gospel is hard to sell. It doesn't fit, and people are inoculated against the gospel. And churches have been in decline in all Western countries since the 1970s. I think that phenomena is so widespread and consistent that to suggest that somehow the biggest part of the explanation is just that we started getting something wrong in the 1960s or 70s. Yes, I'm sure we've made mistakes and we could have done better, but I don't think that alone explains what's happened to church attendance and church influence in the past 40 or 50 years.
I mean, I remember, you and I graduated the same year from theological college, and I remember thinking, wow, the guys before me have been asleep at the wheel, you know, and now I've been out for 20 years working as hard as I can. I haven't been asleep at the wheel, but the results haven't been what I'd hoped that they would be if I worked hard and faithfully over the 20 years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if you look at, say, the NCLS statistics, the number of newcomers at church since 2000, it used to be 12% of your average Australian congregation. It's now 5%. When I was practicing youth ministry in Sydney around the year 2000, there were at least half a dozen youth groups of over 200 kids. I think youth ministry is now down by something like 40% on what it was in the year 2000 in Sydney Anglican churches. And most youth ministries are made up of kids who attend Christian schools.
All right.
And so kind of the state school kid from a non-Christian family is just now suspicious, and it's social suicide to go to a church-based youth ministry. Like, those kind of shifts have made evangelism so much harder. I think John Chapman said it's like ploughing concrete, and the concrete's just set more and more.
We're going to get you back to talk about what do we do with all of this.
Thanks.
But you did tell a story of a kind of a worldview clash moment, speaking in a Christian school under the title of Spirituality That Thrives. And I think people had thought this was going to be a really successful evangelistic title. But talk to me about the disconnect.
Yeah, so a school asked me to speak about their theme for the year, which was spirituality that thrives. And that theme would have been conceived by kind of a leadership team of people probably in their 40s and 50s who wanted to use a kind of a term that's culturally relevant, and it is a very culturally relevant term. But they're speaking to high school students who will interpret
They've
that
imbibed
term.
all that post-Christian worldview you're talking about. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what they're hearing, I suspect, is, I'm a spiritual being. I get to pick and choose the bits that are going to help me become the best version that I can be. And I'm the author of my spiritual story, and I'm the director, and I'm the audience. And so you put all those together, and I get to pick and choose the bits that help me be a spiritual being. So these teenagers believe that there is a spiritual dimension to life, probably more than what was common when we were in high school. Everybody wants to be spiritual, but spirituality is now self-driven, self-selected, rather than actually God has placed eternity in your heart, and He's the one who sets the patterns and sets the goalposts and determines what is spiritual and what isn't.
So where I'm up to is, I thought, wow, David's painted a really clear picture of the problem, and then I think I want to drill down more with you on some of the solutions. So we'll make a date to get you back in a few weeks' time.
Thanks, Dominic.
And to pick up on actually, well, what do we do given all of that?
Yeah, I don't just want to depress people. I do think we actually need to be clear about what has happened, but I think as our culture has changed, we now need to be thinking a little bit more like cross-cultural missionaries. And so what I'm trying to do is explain the new context so that then people can think, how do we now witness, how do we be evangelists and missionaries in this new culture in a way that engages with the yearnings that people have rather than causes them to shut down as they hear us being judgmental.
Thanks so much for coming in, and we'll look forward to part B of this conversation.
Thanks, Dominic.
My guest on the Pastor's Heart, David Rietveld, and he is the Senior Minister of Dapto Anglican Church, and we will be talking to him with some of the answers in a few weeks' time here on the Pastor's Heart. Thanks for your company. We'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday afternoon.